2 Thessalonians 2 is by far the most difficult passage for a pretribulationalist. I've heard many sermons and read many commentaries on this passage from a pre-trib viewpoint, and almost none of them are the same. Most of them take a different route trying to deal with the problem that their view causes here. Let's read it. Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Paul here in this second letter is trying to reason with the Thessalonians, who had been deceived somehow that they had missed the rapture and were now in the day of the Lord. Paul here is using a pretty good argument to prove that this was not the case. He says that neither the falling away nor the Antichrist revealing himself in the temple had happened, and so therefore the rapture could not have happened yet either. Paul is essentially reminding them of the Bible study he gave them of the Olivet Discourse, or Matthew 24. He's about to remind them of what events need to happen before the gathering together. This exact same phrase in English, gathering together, and Greek, episynagoge, are used by Jesus in Matthew 24 to refer to the rapture. So he's explaining what needs to happen before the gathering together can occur. Well, that's simple, Paul says. Don't you remember the Bible study? Don't you remember that before the gathering together, Jesus told us that the abomination of desolation that Daniel spoke of must happen, which, if you look it up in Daniel, as Jesus instructed them to do, you will see that this is when the man of sin sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So Paul says, you haven't seen that happen yet, have you? Well then, that's a sign that the gathering together hasn't happened either. The other thing that Paul reminds them of is that a, quote, falling away must happen first. This word is used exclusively in the Bible as a falling away of faith. The Greek word is apostasia. We will talk more in depth about this word later on. So the question is, does Matthew 24 talk about a falling away from the faith that happens before the gathering together can happen? And it does. It says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. So, to visualize this for you, I put a picture of Matthew 24 on the screen, and I will read the 2 Thessalonians 2 passage, so you can see the correlation between the two with your own eyes. Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit or by word or by letter as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits as God in the temple as God, showing himself that he is God. I think it's pretty clear when you look at it this way. This is a clear refutation of the pillars of pretribulationalism, namely, that there are no events that need to happen before the rapture. It would also mean that the Antichrist must be revealed before the rapture. There are two things that are done to explain this problem by pretribulationalists. The first is that while they will agree that verse 1 is talking about the rapture, when Paul says, now brethren, concerning the coming, or parousia, that word parousia there is the same word used in 1 Thessalonians 4, when Paul is definitely talking about the rapture. So almost no pre-tribulationalist denies that Paul is talking about the rapture in the first verse, but they imply that the rest of the passage is talking about the day of the Lord only, as if Paul said, hey everyone, let me talk to you about the rapture. And then he forgot to talk about the rapture and talked about the day of the Lord instead. And this one is solved if you know Paul's theology about the day of the Lord, which he explains, apparently again to the Thessalonians in the previous chapter, where he describes how the justification of them and the punishment of the wicked all occur on the same day. Paul's theology was that the rapture and the day of the Lord were logically inseparable back-to-back events, as we've already detailed. This verse only makes sense if you know that Paul considers the rapture happening on the very day that the day of the Lord begins. The subject in verse 1, the rapture, never changes. When Paul says the day of Christ and that day, he's talking about the parousia, which starts with the rapture. We remember that the parousia is a multi-staged event, so the rapture is theologically inseparable from the day of the Lord, as it is the very first event in the Lord's parousia. So let's read it with this in mind, and I'm sure that you'll see that Paul does in fact speak to his brethren about the rapture, as well as the day of the Lord. Now, brethren, concerning the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, and our gathering together to him, we ask you not to be soon shaken in mind or troubled, either by spirit, or by word, or by letter, as if from us, as though the day of Christ had come. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the falling away comes first, and the man of sin is revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worship, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Some pre-tribulationalists who see the problems in that view take a different route altogether in dealing with 2 Thessalonians 2. They will argue that the word falling away, or apostasia in the Greek, means departure, and thus is denoting the rapture in that verse. One popular proponent of this theory is Thomas Ice, who writes for RaptureReady.com. He doesn't appeal to the Greek or to any other contextual argument in the New Testament, but instead to early English translations of the Bible, such as the Geneva Bible, that translates the word apostasia as departure in the English. Therefore, they conclude that the rapture is in view where the word falling away is. So it would read, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the rapture comes first, and the man of sin, etc., etc. So, for a moment, let's look past the idea that this would mean that Paul is saying that the rapture can't happen until the rapture happens, and let's look at the details of this word. While it is true that some early English Bibles translated the word apostasia as departure, such as the Geneva Bible, it's also equally evident that the Geneva Bible meant a religious departure. In fact, the Greek term apostasia is only used one other time in the New Testament, in Acts 21:21, where the word forsake is the word apostasia. It says, and they have been told about you that you are teaching all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children, nor to walk according to the customs. In the Septuagint, it's used 5 times in the Old Testament, and every time it means apostasy or rebellion in a religious or political sense, never in a spatial or physical sense. Furthermore, even the very pre-tribulationalist scholar Paul Feinberg, who wrote the argument for the pre-tribulational view in the first edition of The 3 Views of the Rapture for Zondervan, admits, quote, if one searches for the uses of the noun apostasy in the 355 occurrences over the 300-year period between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD, one will not find a single instance where this word refers to a physical departure. This idea of the apostasia being the rapture is sort of a pop view. It's not held among the pre-tribulational scholars in the vast majority, and most good pre-tribulational pastors that I listened to while doing this research openly rejected this view in their sermons.